So now to talk a little bit about CMI's core space. Essentially, we have a core space that generally consists of business-to-business sales and mostly software sales. But some of the examples of the type of industries that we service place salespeople and sales leaders in would be software would be the most common, information services like Gartner or CEB or Forrester, professional services, so companies that sell project-based delivery of, for example, software development services where they're building software applications from scratch, but selling it as a service instead of as a product. If someone has 7 years or less of experience, then as long as they're in business-to-business sales and they're in the DC area, that fits our core space pretty well. We're generally going to be interested in those people. If they have things like pharmaceutical sales, telecommunications sales, so this would be like working for AT&T or Verizon, selling either mobile services or office-based voice and data services, and somebody who's been a mortgage person or in the real estate world, if they have less than 5 years of total experience, that could still work because we can place them into junior roles in the software industry or in professional services or information services. But people who get 10, 15, 20 years in these industries are generally not a fit for us. Same thing goes for copiers or document management services. Less than 5 years, easy transition over to the industries that we serve. Greater than 5 years becomes much more difficult. And the more years in one of these other industries, other than software, information services, or professional services, the greater the difficulty in trying to place them into one of our clients. When you're talking about software sales, and particularly enterprise software sales, which is defined by the size of the organizations that they're calling on and the size of their average deals for an enterprise software salesperson, then they can have any number of years experience. If they're in the Washington, D.C. area and they have either federal sales or commercial sales of software, then that's where a person could have 10, 20, 30 years experience, and we could definitely still work with them or have a strong likelihood of being able to place that person at some point in time. Again, if they're in the DC area and doing enterprise software sales into either the federal government or into the commercial space, when they're not in the DC area, it's always search specific. That wouldn't be part of our core space. That would be, we get an occasional client who says, we need a software salesperson in Denver, and we'll do that search when it makes sense. But that's not a person that we would interview all the time unless we had an open position at that time. Second thing that I want to mention is tenure, which is harder to visually represent, but people's tenure when they have less than 5 years experience, there's a lot more flexibility in the marketplace or a lot more understanding from hiring managers about people who have not the greatest tenure. And tenure essentially means the average length of time at each position. And the perfect length of time for each position would be something like 3 to 5 years. So on a resume full of jobs where a person's worked for 3 years, 4 years, 5 years looks fantastic on a resume. No one has the perfect tenure, but the worse that tenure looks, the bigger a problem it is. And so as an example, when you're talking about in our core space, the more somebody has worked in positions where they worked for fewer than 2 years, multiple times, that becomes more difficult to place. If the person has less than 5 years of total experience, that's easier than if that person has 10 or 15 years experience and they have multiple recent instances of having a job for less than 2 years. Like one job they had for 9 months, another one they had for 18 months, another one they had for 1 year, and then going way back, they had one for 2 years. But the worse the tenure looks, the more difficult it is, and particularly the farther into their career they are, and the worse their recent tenure looks, the more difficult it is. That said, if somebody had a 10 or 15 year stretch of really bad tenure, and then the most recent 3 to 5 years is all with one company, that will generally make up for what happened before that. And unfortunately, the opposite is not really true. If someone had a 6-year stint with one company and then a 4-year stint with another, which so far is fantastic, but for the last 3 years they've worked at 4 companies, that's going to be really, really hard to get past. But again, like with industry, if the person has less than 5 years of overall experience, it's the easiest to get past the tenure issue. So a person who has a total of 3 years experience and has worked in 3 or 4 jobs, that's someone we could potentially still work with. The marketplace is a lot more forgiving of a person who's younger and still learning what they're good at, what they're not good at, what they like and don't like, all those sorts of things. So that's essentially, in a nutshell, what our core space looks like. When it comes to sales management, that's generally also not our core space. That's something we do about 5 to 10% of the time. So we don't interview sales managers as often if we don't have something on the table for that person right now. That's about a 50-50. It's not the same thing as an out-of-towner who we would only interview if we had something for them right now. We still will interview some sales management types if they're local to the DC area, but it's most of the time driven by a position that we get. So we have a sales management position, it's looking for a specific background. We're going out and interviewing tons of sales managers until we find the right one for the client. So that is our core space in a nutshell.